So to start, let's just get an overview of what we've been doing for the last few weeks, what we're going to be doing now and after vacation. So we're considering this still part of taxonomy, so how things are classified. And we went over the basics of taxonomy and classification. Then we talked about sort of the general characteristics of all the kingdoms. And then we talked a little more specifically, just real briefly, about bacteria and archaea. And we spent a fair amount of time on protists. Then we briefly talked about fungi. And so that leaves us with just two kingdoms that we haven't really talked about. What are they? Plants and animals. So we're going to take a week or so to talk about plants. And then with animals, we spend a little bit more time because we talk about some more specifics about not just animals in general, but the different classes and so forth. So we're going to be talking about plants here for the next several classes. And you guys already told me all these things as in your question today. So we know when we're comparing the kingdoms, and we look at those criteria, so you guys said plants are multicellular. So all plants are made of more than one cell. Yeah, it's those characteristics of plants. This is going to change in a minute. They're also all autotrophic. They can make their own food. Through what process? Photosynthesis. And they do that in the chloroplast. So you've already looked at some plant cells a few weeks ago. These are plant cells. You see the rectangular shape. You see they're green. Therefore, they have chloroplasts in them. You can see the individual chloroplasts. As you said earlier, they're eukaryotic. So they have a cell with a nucleus inside of it. The DNA is within the nucleus. It's surrounded by a membrane. Now, we haven't really talked about reproduction yet in plants. How do plants reproduce? James?
Are there seeds?
Using seeds. Are seeds an example of sexual or asexual reproduction? Yeah? They're actually a form of sexual reproduction.
Really?
Yep. We'll talk about this in a few minutes. But they can also, plants can reproduce sometimes asexually as well. So they can use both methods of reproduction depending on the situation. We'll talk more about this. So we've already covered plant cells, so we're not going to do that again. But what would you call this? Central vacuole. Raise your hand if you could tell me, what is this? James?
The cell wall.
Cell wall. What is this whole thing? Raise your hand. Nate? Nucleus. What is this? Kendall? The green, I guess the green one.
Okay, well then, I don't know.
A vacuole.
Green one's the easiest one.
Chloroplast.
Chloroplast. What about this red one? Mitochondria. Good. All right, so you guys remember that. Now, plants are divided into two big groups. Vascular and non-vascular plants. This is one type of plant that I'm holding. This is the other type. Which one is this? What am I holding in this? Moss. I'm going to pass it around so you can see it. We're going to talk a little bit about it. So this is moss. You've seen moss in the forest on the ground and so forth in your yard. So what makes moss different from this geranium that I'm holding? Tatum?
That one is like I don't know how to say it, but there's like leaves on it.
There's, like, you could see individual leaves. Okay, what else? Kendall? A stem. Have you ever seen moss grow upward?
No.
It always grows what?
Flat.
Flat, sort of like a carpet. You can pass that up. So yeah, so the moss that I passed around, that is what's called a non-vascular plant. This geranium and most of the other plants I have back there, they are all vascular plants. Do you know what that word means? Vascular? You may have heard about it in humans, like a vascular surgeon, cardiovascular disease. What do those things have to do with? Sort of the circulatory system, specifically the arteries and veins, vessels. Vascular means having to do with vessels. Vascular plants, such as this geranium, have special tubes within them, vessels we would call them, that can transport things around the plant. So there are vessels in here, tubes within the stem, that can transport things. What would they have to transport from the soil up to here? Matt?
Water.
Water. Now, this moss is non-vascular. It doesn't have those tubes to carry water around. So why doesn't the moss grow tall? Haley?
Because it wouldn't be able to get water.
It wouldn't be able to get water up here. So it grows flat. Basically, all of it has to be in very close proximity to the water. So non-vascular plants like moss, liverwort, hornworts, they grow relatively small, and they grow in wet areas, and they grow flat. Because they have no way of getting water up high in the plant. What is this? Celery. You know those little tubes inside those stringy things? Those are the tubes that are carrying water.
Wait, I didn't.
Skin kind of big, or you pop that. All right, so
Wait, can you do that?
we're going to spend most of our time talking about vascular plants because they're more common. They're probably what you're most familiar with, vascular plants.
Okay.
So vascular plants have these tubes, and there's a couple types of tubes called the xylem and the phloem, and they each carry different stuff. So first of all, the word vascular means having to do with vessels or ducts or tubes. And so vascular plants have these pipelines, these tubes throughout the plant to transport things around. The two main types of tissue are called the xylem and the phloem. So if we look at a sort of a cross-section of a tree, a plant, the xylem is on the inside, phloem is on the outside. The xylem carries water and minerals, and it takes them from the roots up to the other parts of the plant. Remember, that's where plants get their water, from the roots. And what do you think the phloem would carry? The xylem is carrying the water. What else needs to be moved around the plant? Connor? Not carbon dioxide, really. No, because that's water. That's in the xylem. Kind of. You're getting close. The phloem carries something produced in the leaves. It carries it to other parts of the plant. Yeah? Glucose, sugars, nutrients. That's transported in the phloem. You could actually tap into the phloem of a tree and get some of it out. What is it?
Maple syrup.
How we make maple syrup. basically you tap a little tube into the bark of a sugar maple tree. It goes into the phloem, and then as this sugar and water mixture is going through the phloem, some of it comes out, and you capture it in a bucket or in a tube, and then eventually, how do you make that into syrup? You boil most of the other parts away until all you have is sugars, and that's maple syrup. So that's actually how because sometimes people have a hard time remembering which carries water, which carries sugar. So I tell them to remember, the X in xylem in the alphabet is right near W. Right next to each other, WX. The xylem carries water. Phloem, the word syrup ends with a P. Phloem starts with a P. Phloem carries sugar. Just in syrup. I know?
I saw this thing in this movie where it's like the thing you used to get maple syrup, or like it went into the like xylem or whatever, and it got water out. That actually happened in like.
Yeah, because if you go a little deeper, because the phloem is on the outside, if you go a little deeper, then you're into the xylem, and then you get water. So it's not good if you're trying to make syrup, because you want the sugar, so you want to be in the phloem. So these little metal things usually that they just tap into the tree, and then they capture it in buckets or tubes.
So isn't it that, don't people say that maple trees only have maple?
Yeah, the maple syrup comes from only maple trees. There's a special tree, the sugar maple tree. This is where people make syrup out of. So the xylem and the phloem transport materials through the plant. So here we have a plant, obviously. The xylem would bring water from the roots up to the different parts of the plant. The phloem brings the sugar, it's produced generally in the leaves, down to other parts of the plant. Sometimes it's stored in the roots, sometimes it goes to other parts of the plant. So that sugar is transported by the phloem. Have you ever done this experiment? You can actually do it at home, it's simple. Take a piece of celery. You take sort of the larger end and cut it, and then you sort of slice it down the middle. You could put one side in a jar with red food coloring, the other side in a jar with blue food coloring. And what you'll see after a few minutes is the little strings, which what do we know they are now? Xylem. You can see the end of them at the cut end, you'll see them turn color. The red will go up, the xylem is over here, and the blue will go up on this side. Okay?
So I did this for like white flowers, if I cut it and then turn them to leaves like this.
Yeah, did it work well? Yeah, you can do, sometimes they do with flowers, they do the same sort of thing. Yeah. That's cool. All right, so when you're looking at a vascular plant, like my geranium up there, obviously the most obvious part that we see are the above ground parts. Okay? That's the shoot system. The leaves, the stem, and the flowers. But there's also a large proportion of the plant which is underground. And that's the root system. The roots of a plant help keep it stabilized, help keep it upright. And actually they're about the same size as the above ground parts of the plant. So you often don't realize it. But if you see a big tree out there in the courtyard, the roots are just about as big underground as the parts we see above ground. They're hidden from us. We are going to talk now about some of the different parts of the plant. So the leaves of the plant, what's their job? What's the purpose of the leaves? Gavin?
I don't really know, but doesn't it like absorb energy from the sun?
Yeah, it makes glucose, makes food for the plant. The leaves are responsible for photosynthesis. Okay. They have a big surface area so they can absorb lots of light. They have lots of chloroplast in them. The other job of the leaves is to allow gases to come into and out of the plant. Because what gas is needed for photosynthesis? Carbon dioxide is taken in and used during photosynthesis. Right? And so that carbon dioxide gets into the plants through the leaves. There are these special structures on the leaf. So this is like looking at a microscope side of the leaf. See the individual cells. I'll put this up for a minute. And when you look at those cells, you can obviously see, here's a cell. You can see the nucleus in these cells. Here's another. Here's another. So these are the cells. But then if you look closely, you'll see some other parts here. They look like a circle. They look like a pair of lips, maybe. There's a whole bunch of them here. And here's another one. And what these are called stomates. And the middle is an opening that leads into the leaf. Okay? So gases can get in through those openings. So when carbon dioxide is going to get into the plant, it goes through those openings called stomates. Now on each side, these other parts are called the guard cells. And they're able to open or close. And so they can open and allow carbon dioxide in, or they can close. Because what happens when those stomates are open, it's good because carbon dioxide can get into the leaf, but at the same time, water can evaporate through those openings. And so if it's a very, very hot and dry day and a plant is sort of dehydrated, those guard cells might close up. So water stops leaving the plant through those stomates. So they help to conserve water. That process by which water comes into the roots of a plant, goes up the xylem, out to the leaves, and then out through those stomates, that process is called transpiration. Taking in water, bringing it up, and then releasing it through the stomates. That's called transpiration. A hot day, a dry day, there's a lot of transpiration, and less so on a cooler or more humid day. We're going to talk about one last general overview. So the plant, if I ask you to think of a plant, chances are you're thinking of an angiosperm. An angiosperm is another name for a flowering plant. Okay? Plants that produce flowers at some point. So this geranium is not flowering right now, but it's a flowering plant. It's an angiosperm. It will produce flowers at some point. But some plants do not. For example, this fern back here is not a flowering plant. It doesn't produce flowers. Okay? It reproduces in a different way. So flowering plants, what's the purpose of flowers? Why do plants have flowers at all? To look pretty, no?
I know all plants do this, but don't they like create oxygen?
Well, that's all parts of the plant, not the flowers, Gavin.
I don't really know. I'm guessing oil, I guess. So the bees can sew it.
Well, they're related, but that doesn't help the plant at all, Abby.
Like pollinate?
Close, because pollination is involved in what for plants? Reproduction. Flowers are actually the reproductive organs of a plant. So just like animals have reproductive organs, plants do as well. And that's what a flower is. So if Christmas is coming, give your mom a nice bouquet of flowers. What you're really giving her are the reproductive organs of plants. That's what flowers are. Okay? And flowers have male reproductive organs in them, and they have female reproductive organs. Some flowers have both in one flower. Some have just male parts, some have just female parts. It depends on the type of plant. And eventually, what do flowers produce that is involved in reproduction? Taylor? Seeds. They eventually develop seeds, which can then grow into new plants. A seed is just basically a plant embryo. So when we said plants reproduce asexually and sexually, flowers are how plants reproduce sexually. This will be our last slide for today. So I have this model of a flower. Okay? Flower has a couple parts. These bottom parts, the green part, they look like leaves here. They're actually called the sepal. And they help give the flower its base and protect it. You know, if you imagine a tomato you buy at the grocery store, the little green part on top, it's like a star. That's the sepal of what was once the flower of that tomato.
Like,
Yeah, so have you ever grown tomatoes at home? Yeah, so you know, what does a tomato begin as? It's a flower, a yellow flower. Once it gets pollinated, the fruit starts to develop, the actual tomato, and inside of the fruit are the seeds, and that's how it reproduces. The petals on flowers are often brightly colored, and often that's to help them attract animals. Why do flowers attract animals? Why is that helpful to the flower? James?
Once an animal picks up something from the flower, it will spread it to other
Yeah.
plants.
The animal can pick up pollen from one flower, and then when it goes to feed in another flower, spread that pollen to the next and help with reproduction. So all things that reproduce sexually have special cells called gametes, or sex cells. In animals, we call them sperm and egg cells. The male is a sperm cell, it's a reproductive cell, and the female has an egg cell. Well, flowers have the same thing, they have gametes as well. We just call them by different names. So what's the male gamete in a flower? It's like sperm of flowers. You all know the word and you've heard the word, you just probably didn't know what it actually was. Many of you might be allergic to it. Pollen. Pollen, stuff that blows around in the springtime from trees. Pollen is just basically plant sperm. Okay, it's reproductive cells. Those little tiny pollen grains, each one is the male reproductive cell. Inside of the flower are female reproductive cells, like the eggs. They're called ovules. And if a pollen grain grows and connects with an ovule, then it's been fertilized. And it can then grow into a seed. That's called fertilization. So plants reproduce sexually through pollination. So, having dinner with your family over this vacation, and you have some flowers around on the table, you could explain to them exactly what you have there. We'll talk after vacation about the actual parts within the flower and what each part does. Yes.